at the Alan Turing Institute, our mission is to make great leaps in data science and artificial intelligence research in order to change the world for the better.
This podcast explores the research, ideas and technologies behind the data revolution with the people responsible for shaping our future.
Welcome to the Turing Podcast. Hello everyone and welcome to the Turing Podcast. Today we're speaking with Geoff Goodell, who is a Senior Research Associate in the Financial Computing and Analytics Group at University College London, as well as being an Associate of UCL's Centre for Blockchain Technologies and the LSE Systemic Risk Centre. I've invited Geoff on the podcast after he gave a really interesting talk to one of my project groups at the Alan Turing Institute, in which he strongly advocated for privacy as human right in the digital world, in particular with regard to digital identity, which is a topic we've covered on the podcast before. Geoff, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ed. Good afternoon.
I thought I'd start off by, if you could tell us a bit about the scale of data collection occurring in the world today. I've heard the term surveillance capitalism being used before. So what does that mean to you?
So first of all, I think the scale of data collection is, of course, large, ultimately because when information is produced and received, it is generated and generally doesn't get deleted. So if we think about the order of magnitude of how many exabytes people generate on a daily basis, we actually get to see that this is a very widespread phenomenon. It's taking place not only in the context of people's internet browsing habits, but also much more generally than that, in terms of their use of electronic services, including public services such as wireless networks and mobile phones, all the way to metro systems and ID cards that are used in a wide variety of applications throughout the world.
Yeah, it's the world of big data, and it's something that we like to think about a lot at the Alan Turing Institute. But yeah, that data isn't always used for necessarily the purposes that we might like. I just want to quote back to you something that I saw in one of the slides from the talk you gave before. And it's a quote from Mark Zuckerberg back in 2009. And the quote is, so starting the quote, "You have one identity. The days of you having a different image for your work friends or co-workers and for the other people you know are probably coming to an end pretty quickly." And then he goes on to say, "Having two identities for yourself is an example of a lack of integrity." So that's the end of the quote. And my question is, firstly, before we get into talking about your own research, but at what point in your own life and career did you realize, as someone with a computer science background, but who also thinks about human rights, that there was a particular philosophy at play here with the big tech companies and social media companies and so on?
Yes, I think that's right. I think that the philosophy was, at one level, that the world is improved by transparency, and if you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear, and therefore we should just live transparent lives. And that would make everything better because of the panopticon effect, that people behave better when they are being watched. Certainly here in London, this is not we're not new to this idea. I mean, Jeremy Bentham wrote about the panopticon in the early 1800s, 2 centuries ago, and that was broadly the idea. If people know that they might be currently being watched, then they will change their behavior, presumably towards something that the people doing the watching would want. Now, we know that this idea of you have nothing to hide means nothing. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. We know that odious philosophy was used during the Second World War in the following century, and of course was part of the inspiration for George Orwell's work on the topic. But more generally, I think we have this idea, this philosophy that people will just be better off if they just share everything. And I think also there was a bit of a concern that people don't want to engage in communication with other people so much as they might want to use the internet as a kind of a way to communicate, a way to improve their communication, because they might be nervous speaking with people directly. They might be nervous with the sort of psychological effect of believing that other people are watching. Maybe if they're using the internet, they might feel that they're in the privacy of their own homes, so maybe they would be more likely to share aspects of themselves. All of these factors, I think, were in play in various forms. And I think that when Mark Zuckerberg described his motivation for the various policies that Facebook had used, I think that he was being honest about the goals of Facebook's project, which was to really make it so that people have one face to present to the world, ultimately, because if people present the same face to everyone, then there's authenticity that is embedded in the idea that if I look for information about Geoff, I know that whatever he's saying on Facebook is the same Geoff that everyone else is saying. And it's a bit ironic because Facebook itself provides a medium for looking different to different people and for providing different information to different people, and indeed for allowing the various media platforms that use its identity services to allow those platforms to look different for different users. This idea seems to underscore the idea that if you're in control of the ability to force people to have one identity, then you're really in a position of power, and you, as an organization, are better off having many identities for exactly the same reason, because having many identities is power, and forcing other people to have fewer identities is a mechanism of control. And I think Shoshana Zuboff highlights this very well, not only in her recent book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, but also in other articles that she's written over the years, including the article that is known as Big Other, where she first described this phenomenon.
It's interesting that, you mentioned her, and Rachel in her first question mentioned the surveillance capitalism term. I guess the thing that's different from the people who you mentioned 100 years ago, people like Orwell, they were obviously thinking of, well, all of this is going to come from the state, whereas what we're seeing now is, I guess surveillance capitalism is a good way of describing it. It's, companies collecting data on people, and what they do with it may just be for profit, but that could also have downsides, including selling that information to governments or whoever else want the highest bidder, I guess.
I thought it was quite interesting that you were talking about the idea that what Mark Zuckerberg was saying was honest in the aims of Facebook and having this idea of having a one identity, and it makes it more authentic. So do you think, because it's just an idea I've been sort of hearing about quite a lot, this idea that sort of the big tech companies weren't coming out with evil intent in terms of data collection, but rather sort of good concepts that were implemented badly or have had unpredictable ramifications. And do you kind of sit into that camp, or do you kind of feel like there was more that the idea of having this data collection was kind of the concept to begin with?
Yeah, I think what you're asking is, was it really the original motivation of Mark Zuckerberg and his team to collect data and provide a means of control for whoever happened to want it, the highest bidder, basically, as we've seen with the Cambridge Analytica scandal and all of these other instances. It's not the Facebook staff themselves trying to manipulate people, but it's rather the collection of information and the brokering of data and analytics that are derived from the data that are collected by Facebook that gives rise to this. I think that I think that there is evidence that it's not about Facebook explicitly wanting to manipulate people in some particular way, but I think it's a much more perhaps a much colder calculation that if you're selling that if you are collecting these kinds of data, it's a mechanism to promote advertising. That's how people make money. This phenomenon, as Shoshana Zuboff described, I think really didn't start inside Facebook. It started in Google actually in around 2003, 2004, and then ultimately was brought into Facebook subsequently. So I'm pretty confident that this model of selling analytics was not necessarily Facebook's original intent. However, I would add a caveat to that to say that this idea that individual persons should present one face to the world, or this idea that we're creating this set of linkages, this sort of reference point for people, it's hard to imagine that this goal could be undertaken without some degree of thoughtfulness about what the implications would be. In the real world, we interact by sharing different faces with different people in different contexts. I control the narrative about who I am and about what I stand for and about what my habits are, what my affect is, all of these sorts of things. I have quite a substantive control over that representation of myself that I share with different people, and I'm absolutely a different person with my family than with my friends, and with my colleagues. I might be several different people just in those contexts, and I think most people are. But enter the Facebook platform, and suddenly everyone is down to the least common denominator, a phenomenon that's called context collapse. And I think that this context collapse phenomenon must not have been far from the minds of people thinking about forcing people into this kind of sort of viewport where you can only see one perspective on someone, and that it is the entire perspective, whatever that means. This idea of uncovering the real you, so to speak.
It definitely sounds that way, Geoff, from the quote that we just gave from Zuckerberg, the fact that he said that having multiple identities is a lack of integrity. So that would seem to back up your idea that, from the start, there's definitely some, ideas at play here rather than just responding to the incentives that his company faces. That being said, the one that I can think of, the incentive that is at play here, which we haven't commented on yet, is that there's all this talk of, they need to limit the trolling and the bots and the misinformation and so on. And of course, people doing that are, by definition, anonymous. They're not using their real names. They're not having the one face that Facebook wants them to have. And there's an incentive there for the social media platforms to try and shut down all of that. Much of it will be bad and spreading misinformation. Some of it will be, legitimate reasons why people might want to remain anonymous. But I guess all of the news stories that Facebook and Twitter and so on have had to endure about their platforms spreading misinformation and undermining democracy, it's obviously that's got to be bad for business at some point. So that sort of, to me, I think further reinforces the idea that they need to be really strictly on this idea that it's, you have one account, you have one face, you have one identity.
Well, this does seem to be a large part of the problem. Now let me just say right out there that I'm somewhat sympathetic to these arguments that these platform operators need to recognize their impact on democracy and need to perhaps police the content of what transpires on their networks. But I don't see this as an obligation that these firms should have so much as a symptom of a problem, a deeper problem, that Facebook is in this position to broker relationships, to facilitate influence within the network. The fact that they are facilitating influence of any kind, good, bad, or indifferent, is the problem. It's not it's not just the problem that it's not just the fact that they happen to be facilitating toxic narratives that promote echo chambers and so on. I think the problem really is that Facebook has a role of broker in establishing people's connections, and that's really where I would like to point the finger to the problem. I think that once we start going down the road of saying that Facebook needs to block, say, Donald Trump, for example, I mean, certainly I'm no fan of Donald Trump, but I would like to say that it's a bit disturbing to me that Donald Trump or anyone would be silenced by a social media network operator. And I say this not because I want to see those ideas being promoted widely throughout the world, but rather that it is disturbing that Facebook is in a position to decide what gets brokered and what doesn't get brokered. And that is extremely scary and extremely dangerous. And rather than suggest as a solution that social media platforms like Facebook or Twitter should silence some dangerous actors, I think that we have to take a step back, understand what the real problem is, which is that Facebook is introducing people to voices that aren't in their networks already, and that people go to Twitter and Facebook to be a part of what they think of as being the public square. But it's not a public square. It's a private system that has private actors that are controlling the infrastructure in a very fundamental and perhaps dangerous way. I would like to suggest that we don't really know how to create a public square of the kind of size and scope of a Facebook or a Twitter that is truly public the way that real public squares are. And I think that these analogies really don't do justice to the phenomenon of what is going on at a direct sort of personal and technical level in terms of these introductions to voices, and that I would suggest is the core problem. Now, you said something else that is interesting, which is about anonymity. And you're suggesting that some of these actors on these platforms are anonymous. And all that I have to say is that anonymity is not the same as not signing your name. An identity is really a set of attributes. And attributes might be transactions, they might be characteristics, they might be identifiers of various sorts. But they're a set of attributes that relates to ultimately a relationship between entities. Now, the ISO standard on this says that an identity is a set of attributes about an entity. I think that that's perhaps a bit wrong. I would suggest that it is a set of attributes about a relationship, because nobody gets the same view of a particular identity, and no one gets the same view of a particular entity, and in fact, it's not. The characteristics that we build are really about that relationship more than about our ability to establish ground truth about an entity. I mean, at the risk of sounding a bit Cartesian, I worry about this idea that we want to create universal truth about entities. That seems dangerous. But nonetheless, this idea of anonymity is about these attributes, and ultimately, if you're linking these attributes to each other, you're building a profile about someone, whether or not that someone has a name or is linked to anything that's strongly identifying them, like biometrics or a phone number, for example. And the idea that people are communicating online via these platforms anonymously, I think, is debatable for the most part. I mean, yes, there are tools that increase our privacy, such as Tor, for example. And there are protocols that provide for anonymous or much more anonymous communication up to a limit, like Mixmaster, for example, for email. But ultimately, these tools are only partial solutions to this problem of unlinking our attributes from each other. And I think that if we really look under the covers, most of the people who communicate in these forums are not truly anonymous, and in many cases are not even close to anonymous.
They may not fully understand the exact technical reasons, as you probably do, why they're not anonymous. It depends who they are, of course, but I'm sure many of them feel that they're fully anonymous, whether they really are or not. So.
I think it's interesting you kind of talking about this idea of like having a single like source of truth in terms of your identity, because I know that there's a push right now from like a lot of the world's governments towards creating sort of a single digital identity for their citizens that can be used for like a variety of different government like resources for like accessing housing as an example. And like some of this is about using like biometric attributes such as fingerprints, but like so what are your views on that concept from a state approach and how it could be good stroke bad?
I think it's very dangerous. I mean, let me just be really clear. I think this idea of establishing one sort of unitary identifier, and by unitary identifier I mean something that someone has only one of. One identity, one face. If a government wants to create one face that people present to many different contexts, then that becomes a problem, because people will ultimately feel a legitimate need to escape from the profile that's been built on the back of their of what had been pinned to that one face. And yes, there are different efforts that have been built to with exactly, as you say, exactly that objective in mind. I mean, certainly in Estonia, there is an identity system that the state has implemented that effectively encourages people to use an identity in different contexts, which is precisely about allowing this kind of profiling to happen and establishing this kind of linkage. But I really do think that we need to ask some tough questions, like what about cases of people who are witnesses to a crime, or victims of abuse, or refugees, or ordinary people who just want a fresh start. These people, I think, are really put in danger by a system that ultimately maintains history of them. And this is, I think, the core of what the European Union has identified in its characterization of the right to be forgotten inside GDPR. The idea here is that really people have a certain kind of a right to establish a new identity. And they haven't described it very clearly, perhaps, and maybe the law itself isn't strong enough to give us what we need. But I think this recognition of this value in being able to unlink the different aspects of our history is really essential. And I'll give you perhaps a case in point: medical histories. One might imagine that people might be okay with having one universal medical history run by their medical organization at the state level, like NHS, or even something that's universal to their general practitioner. The problem is that if people can only have one general practitioner, or can only have one health services provider, then what happens when they want to seek consultation for something that they don't want to have on their permanent record? And let's be clear, there are lots of medical circumstances or information that can be derived from medical records that might be very sensitive to someone. You can figure out, for example, someone's drug use pattern. You can find out their pre-existing conditions. I mean, wouldn't it be really interesting if an employer could get access to drug use patterns and say, I think that you were formerly a cocaine addict, so I'm not going to hire you. Or perhaps I think that you have diabetes, so maybe I don't want to be paying your medical bills. Or and so on. And I think that this only scratches the surface. I mean, if someone's medical history indicates that they might be, say, LGBT, for instance, they might find themselves in trouble in certain parts of the world that might not necessarily look kindly on that, and that's a real problem. So I think that this idea of forcing people to bind all of their records together into one unified view, whether this is about internet browsing or financial history or medical records or anything else, I think is really problematic. And I think we need to pause on those efforts to try to build assurance and strong non-transferability for everything, because in some cases more assurance is not better and is actually worse, not only for the system, but also for the individuals who use it.
I think it's I thought it really interesting that you brought up Estonia, actually, because I was going to say that I think when this sort of the concept of state surveillance or like controls of identity from the state level is mentioned, people often think about sort of dictatorship type countries or places where like human rights aren't followed. Whereas Estonia is interestingly often held up as an example of a really good digital state and a state that's doing like really good things. But then actually, I guess like listening to you talk, then it's kind of like the underlying technology and the underlying concepts are the same. It's the how it's enacted might be slightly different, but then I guess it's still vulnerable to the same things.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that there are questions about trust, and I think there are some kinds of arguments around this as well, such as the idea that, oh, well, here in Estonia, people just trust each other more. They're more open, and that makes them better. I think that these are dangerous arguments, or conversely, the government has better data protection and would never succumb to the kinds of horrible history that the rest of Europe has seen in its past. I think that there is hubris in these arguments, and I think that we need to think really carefully about what the implications of these kinds of statements are, and we see them. I think in every government, in every culture that wants to implement these systems, as well as corporations in the private sector as well. We see this in Europe, we see this in the U.S., we see this in Asia. This is not, this should not be surprising.
Okay, so you're definitely more on the side of this kind of tool is just so open to abuse that it's that there's. It's not worth pursuing. I guess if I was going to play devil's advocate, and this is a difficult one for me to do because I'm not sure I personally believe in what I'm about to say, but so when there are other countries thinking about adopting, say, a national identity system, especially countries that already don't already have established ways of identifying yourself, like in the UK. Hopefully, the principle of having different identities between myself and the NHS or myself and HMRC might be at least to some degree respected because of the historical legacy reasons that we just happen to have set it up that way rather than having a single ID document or whatever. But if you take a country like India, which has adopted this national ID system in the last few years, on the basis of most people didn't have any provable identity documents before, and they want to be able to streamline the provision of welfare and healthcare and whatever else the government provides in terms of services, that their argument there would be that look how much good it's doing, and you Westerners with your, I mean, they probably wouldn't say it like so condescendingly as I'm about to, but you Westerners with your ideas of, trying to preserve everyone's freedom and so on. But we're more importantly, we just want economic development. That's the main thing that makes people's lives better.
Right.
What would your response be to that?
Yeah, well, I guess there are several responses. I mean, first, the question is economic development at what cost? I mean, there is very little question that it's possible for a society to achieve quite rapid economic development just by establishing a very powerful autocracy and then commanding people to do as they say. And if this is what we want, then if that's the only measurement, if that's the only problem that we're trying to solve, then I can't really argue with it. But I think that we're looking to solve a deeper problem, perhaps. And you mentioned this idea of people not having any identity at all, and perhaps things being set up a certain way in many of the Western countries, like for example in the UK, where our taxpayer ID is different from our national insurance number, which is different from the other numbers that we use in our day-to-day lives. And I think that really there are two aspects to this. The first is that there's a reason why our taxpayer ID is for taxes, right? And why this is okay. It's because I use my taxpayer ID for the purpose of paying taxes, for getting tax refunds, for reporting my compliance with tax laws, and nothing else. And I use my NHS number for communicating with my GP, and for registering for health-related business, and nothing else. And it's the separation that allows us to have some freedom from being profiled by having everything be connected into one sort of unified ID. It is precisely the linkage that causes the problem. It is precisely when we can start to paint a single unified picture of a person that we can start to abuse them via surveillance. And I think that that's what we should be concerned about. Now, I recognize that there has been an argument that sometimes people have no identity, but and need to have some kind of a system established for facilitating that. But I have to push back on this. Because I know that this is the UN Sustainable Development Goal 16.9, which is this idea of identities for everyone. I have to push back on this a bit because what problem are we trying to solve? That's the question that we need to ask. And if the problem is that people don't have access to some particular service, then let's talk about that particular service, and let's think about how at the system level we can make sure that they have access to this. And there are many more ways to do this than to provide a globally unique identifier for every person. And I think that if we look at, in some contexts, in the financial context, for example, since that's the core of my work, I can tell you that some consulting firms around the world have pushed this idea of financial inclusion being equated with the ability to get loans, or the ability to open bank accounts, or the ability to have affordable insurance, and so on. And I think that we need to ask ultimately whether these particular kinds of services are really human rights. And I think in many cases the answer is no. I think it's debatable whether giving people access to cheaper loans is actually going to make their lives better. And certainly I can see an argument that suggests that there is a certain colonialism intrinsic to the idea that before you lend to someone, you need to make sure that they behave properly. This idea that some wealthy corporation or lender might say, I'd really love to lend to these savages, but really I'll only do that if they submit to being watched by me. This seems like a really dangerous sort of road to travel.
Interesting. Very sort of profound point you've made there. What you were saying at the start of that leads me quite nicely into the next question, talking about what should be considered a human right and what isn't. So you mentioned already about how traditionally a person's identity is thought of a set of attributes that defines them or that identifies them. But in your work, you've spoken about how it could be better from considering privacy as a human right perspective to see ID as a set of attributes related to a relationship between people or between people and the providers of a service, be that a commercial or government service. And then this comes back to what we were talking about, people having different multiple identities. So can you talk a bit about why the ability for people to have multiple identities that cannot be linked, and that's the crucial part, why that perhaps ought to be considered a human right, perhaps as opposed to a human right to give someone a loan?
People are always reinventing themselves, right? People face, it's part of the human condition to face this question of who we ought to be, what we want our impact on the world to be, right? What we wind up experiencing in life, I think, has been described by various people over the years, including Machiavelli. I think had said it's half fate and half our efforts, and we can't really tease them apart entirely, right? But I think ultimately people have some influence, maybe not perfect influence, but they have some influence over of how they change the world and what they experience in life. And I think the problem with having only one identity is that you're forcing someone into one particular history that they cannot escape. And it's the human condition to establish different identities as we evolve, as we decide to change who we are, as we decide to try out different styles of interacting with the world, different ways of being. And to take this away is to take away something very fundamental that makes us human. And I wish I could describe it more succinctly than that, or perhaps in a more scientifically grounded way. But suffice it to say that science fiction authors in much of the 20th century had pictured this future world in which computers would become more like humans. Whereas I think we've seen, after the end of the 20th century, that in reality it is humans who have become more like computers. It is humans who are programmed. It is humans who can be controlled via the collection of data and so on. And I worry very much about this. And I think that this idea of multiple unlinkable identities as a way to describe our natural state of being as human beings in establishing relationships on our own terms is really something that it would be perhaps dangerous to lose. And imagine a world in which everyone could see our histories before they decide whether to talk to us. Well, that's the world that we're building, and I'm not sure that that's where we want to be.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, although I'm loath to blame the public and individual people as well as the providers of the technology and people making decisions, there's a certain amount of if you tweet something a few years ago and then it gets pulled up and it's like, well, should you have tweeted it in the first place? But then maybe I'm wrong to think that. Maybe it's like, well, I shouldn't be concerned about what people thought about what I thought when I was 16 or something. It's a difficult conundrum, but yeah.
Well, I think it's natural to be concerned, right? Because this is part of the world. To ignore how people are reacting to us, I think, would be to ignore part of the environment, to ignore part of what makes us human as well. So I think it's very natural to regret decisions that we've made. For example, that message that you might have posted to Twitter at some point in the past, maybe 10 years ago. I can understand how people can regret it. I can understand how it might be comforting to think, well, it doesn't really matter what people think. They ought to forgive me. But the reality is that some people will never forgive you. And I think this says a lot about the problems with establishing a kind of permanent record. If you're making a statement in a platform environment where it's only a few of your friends and no central broker, then you can ask these friends to forgive you. Whereas I think once we've gotten something into one of these sort of faceless global platforms that have records that last forever and never get deleted, I think we've created a big problem for this notion of forgiveness. And again, this goes back to the GDPR question. What is the right to be forgotten? And how well can it be enforced in reality, right? The mechanisms inside GDPR for enforcing the right to be forgotten do not guarantee that this history of yours is gone from the world. Someone could very easily capture information about you and post it anonymously to WikiLeaks in a way that it exists forever, and European regulators will never track down who has it, and that's a real problem. I think that we do need to be scrupulous with our decisions to post statements on these kinds of platforms, to be sure. Although I think there is a problem with what we have built as a society in terms of its infrastructure that makes that mechanism for speaking a de facto aspect of our societal expectation for what people want, for what people do, how people interact. I think that there's a real problem with that, and I think that we can't really escape it very easily. I think we'll need to convince people that actually this idea of having a global public Twitter is problematic. Like, how do we get people to think more carefully about that? I think that this is a question about our social infrastructure first and foremost, because some people really will always make statements in this kind of global context. They will be audacious, and sometimes they'll regret it. I don't think that the right solution is to stop people from doing that. I think the right solution is to think about the infrastructures that we've built. Think about whether we want Twitter to be a public medium of exchange that is used by our governments and our institutions. And if the answer is yes, I think we've got a problem.
I think that leads really nicely onto your own research. And I was wondering, like, if as much in layman's terms as possible for those of us who aren't super technical, sort of what are the problems that you think that your own research into digital identity hopes to solve, and what is your research into that, and how can technology like blockchain help to realize the idea of multiple IDs that can't be linked?
Yeah, so I think that there are a number of different aspects to this question. So the first thing that I'd like to point to is that much of my work these days is divided into a few different areas. One of which is digital currency, and I want to point out first of all that digital payment systems are a major form of surveillance today, and this is not a new observation. This has been known for over half a century. Since around the early days of credit cards. And as we know, credit cards were really started because people didn't have access to clearing networks in an online sense all the time. If you remember those machines that went ka-chunk, ka-chunk, that would take the embossed cards and would print them on a sheet of carbon paper, leaving an imprint.
I have to say I'm probably not old enough to remember that.
Sorry, I'm an old curmudgeon. You've outed me. But basically. Yeah, basically the reason that we have credit cards is that we basically needed to provide credit to consumers who didn't necessarily want to carry around large wads of cash and didn't necessarily want to make all of these payments with in cash at the point of sale, and we needed to give them credit for a very short period of time, like maybe 3 days, because we didn't have finality with the settlement, because we didn't have the ability for the merchant to call up their bank or a network that led to their bank account and get and potentially get an immediate debit. And this is a real issue. This is a real concern, and we see that there are echoes of this still, right? So even with debit cards, we don't get immediate finality, right? We still might have. We still have settlement that might take a day. Even with credit cards in the modern context, we still see the possibility of clawbacks that face merchants when a client calls up their bank and says, "Hey, wait a minute, this someone stole my card. That flat screen television that was just purchased was not purchased by me." And then the bank says, "Okay, we trust you." These are actually forms of credit that are being extended, and perhaps a bit of paternalism along with that, in terms of providing someone with good faith service in exchange for being able to know something about their habits. Now, go back to 1957, and Paul Armour of the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, California, had said, "Well, I'm concerned about this. I'm concerned about people using these these card payments and the future of possible electronic payments to monitor my habits, my locations, my travel, my associations, and so on. Every time I buy so much as a newspaper or a candy bar," I think was what he had said. And this is actually a real concern. And granted, that system that Paul Armour was concerned about in 1967 did not really come into reality until decades later, but now it's here, and it's very much here. And now we have this kind of concern where people are basically being forced by merchants and shops and restaurants to show ID, to identify themselves to a platform before they can make purchases. There are many businesses here in London that refuse cash payments, and that's really problematic. In addition to discriminating and choosing their clientele, which is a problem in itself, this idea that they're forcing their customers to identify themselves is a real problem.
So is it that just by using a card, you're by definition identifying yourself?
You're absolutely identifying yourself. That's what a card is. It's an ID card. I mean, a bank card is a kind of ID card. It's tied to an account which is tied to you. It's just a mechanism for identifying you. It's not, by the way, like a non-custodial cryptocurrency wallet or digital currency wallet, which might hold tokens anonymously and might be able to send tokens anonymously. That would be something different, but that's not what bank cards are. I think in many people's mind's eyes, bank cards are basically just that, right? Bank cards are basically a mechanism for giving you cash. It's just electronic. Well, that's just not true. It's a mechanism for identifying yourself and then asking your bank to send money to the bank of your merchant. And at all steps, the banks and the payment systems in the interim can intermediate your transaction. They can build a profile on who you are, or who your merchants are, and who your counterparties are, and ultimately can create this risk of control. That's associated with this idea that they can nudge you toward behaving in certain ways on the basis of the profile that they build about you. So this is not the same as holding money. Like, you might ask, well, why would someone use electronic payments at all? If with cash they can choose their currency, they don't have the risk of being profiled. They don't have the risk of being intermediated or blocked. They know that their money is as good as everyone else's because it reveals nothing else about them. Versus electronic transactions, which are exactly the opposite of all of those things. Why would they do that? And I think that this story of convenience has been fed into the narrative in a way that discourages people from thinking critically about what's going on. And the reality is that you're giving your information to not only your bank, but also your payment network and other parties who track all of the counterparties that you have, all of the counterparties that your counterparties have, and so on.
You might be much more concerned about someone robbing your wallet full of cash on the street than you are about the bank, collecting your data. And so having a card which you can then, if it's stolen, easily cancel it and that kind of thing, that seems like that's the trade-off that's been made. That and maybe it's not an ideal trade-off, but it does. Yeah, it's a trade-off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a number of possible responses to that. I mean, the first of which is just that there is some element of paternalism in this trade-off, and is it really right for us to be making this choice on behalf of all people? Right. That's my first response. But I think there's a second response as well, which is, can we facilitate secure electronic transactions that take place in a way that allows people to have this kind of security of being able to communicate with their own servers, perhaps, or if they're able to take that, have some key that they can use to cancel the money that was in that digital wallet that was just stolen, for example. And there are techniques to do this. And I can just point to David Chaum's paper in 1982, Blind Signatures for Untraceable Payments, where he describes some of these mechanisms. So it is possible to build a digital a digital transaction infrastructure that provides both privacy and the ability to achieve the kinds of protections that you're describing. But we haven't built it yet, and there hasn't really been a lot of discussion about it. And I think part of the reason is that we've come to rely upon data revenues to subsidize the infrastructure that we build. And this is a real concern. And it's a real concern in the UK in the question of open banking, which, by the way, was always intended to or pitched as a way to disintermediate transactions. But in reality, we see that since open banking was introduced, it is not the direct debits that have taken the place of card payments, but it's card payments that have taken the place of cash payments. And I would argue that means that open banking has failed, or at least it's failed on something that it's been pitched as that it should have achieved. And this is a real concern, because when we talk about open banking and faster settlements and all these sorts of things, benefiting whom? It does not really matter for an average person on the street buying a cup of coffee that the settlement for the purchase takes place in a day or a week. But if we do want to encourage faster settlement for everyone, then that comes at a cost, right? It comes at a cost of the revenues to the participants in the clearing network, first of all, but also in terms of the liquidity risk that they have to face. And I think that this is I think that we need to think very critically about what the plan is for subsidizing these kinds of changes and who these kinds of changes benefit. And if these changes are to be subsidized by data revenues, I think we're in trouble.
Is it fair to say that people who sort of agree with your line of thinking would be pro-Bitcoin, pro-cryptocurrency? And is that an avenue that could solve some of these problems, or are there just inherent flaws with that as well?
Well, unfortunately, there are inherent flaws with that. I mean, to be clear, I'm no huge fan of Bitcoin or even cryptocurrency in general, but I have to say that if we look to the history of cryptocurrency, we wind up going all the way back, not to the Satoshi Nakamoto paper in 2009, which introduced Bitcoin. No, we have to go back much further. And I mentioned David Chaum's paper, but David Chaum's objective was to build a countless digital cash. That's what people wanted. People wanted to be able to spend money electronically over the internet. That's something that people have wanted for a very long time, 40 years at least. But the problem is that that's just not the reality.
But was he saying specifically that people wanted untraceable digital cash?
I think that people did want digital cash. And digital cash implies a certain degree of untraceability, right? Because that's what cash is. And that's something that we've had. Ever since we've had money, we've had the ability to transact with something that's truly fungible, that's not linked to our identity in any way, and in a way that doesn't result in us sharing our counterparty information in such a way of a manner of spraying our data everywhere we go. And unfortunately, with modern retail banking, we've stepped away from that. Now, I do believe that there is an element of cryptocurrency being popular precisely because it allows people to transact away from the gaze of the corporate and state surveillance machine. Although I think, as we've discovered with Bitcoin and Ethereum and so on, that is not exactly true. These online payments using these mechanisms can actually be traced very well. And even in the case of privacy-enhancing cryptocurrencies like Zcash or Monero, the anonymity sets are so small that you're really not getting the kind of privacy that the underlying cryptographic algorithms might otherwise imply, right? The privacy that you get is more theoretical than real. Yes, we can use those algorithms to good effect, but I think if we really want to do that, we need to make these institutionally accepted. And I think that making an institutional infrastructure, building an institutional infrastructure that allows people to have a public payment option that does not disclose their identities and associate it with all of their habits and locations and counterparties, I think is going to be needed in order to make that a reality. And that's why I've been spending so much of my time working on digital currency and central bank digital currency in particular.
Something I find really interesting about the concept of a cashless society specifically is I think it's a bad idea, but not from a sort of surveillance point of view, but from the kind of concept of like accessibility to society. So, for example, like homeless people can get access to cash, but can't get access to bank accounts because they don't have a fixed address. They don't have any of those other forms of identification. But then on the flip side, lots of proponents of, say, cryptocurrency talk about it replacing standard national currencies, but has a similar accessibility issue of you have to be tech savvy, you have to be able to access the internet, you have to have all these skills and like things in place that cost money to get, like an internet connection. Not everyone in the world has an internet connection. So I think it's just an interesting like counterpoint that I've never really thought. Whenever I've thought about cashless society, I've come at it from like that kind of accessibility perspective, which I think applies to both equally. But the identity side is an interesting counterpoint, I think.
Yeah. So yes, I think that part of this is related to this identity question. Like, are we really going to insist that electronic payments require people to be identified? Well, that's dangerous in itself. Although I have to add that some countries, such as France, have taken the approach that we can solve this problem just by making sure that everyone has the right to a bank account. So in France, everyone can get a bank account, and it's different than it is here in the UK or in many other countries. But I don't think that that's the whole story either. I think that you mentioned accessibility, but it goes beyond that, right? Yes, there is the idea that banknotes are tangible objects, and people get to do their own budgeting better. And yes, there are certain things that they can do. I can share a £20 note with someone else in my family without the worry that I have to involve, all of the apparatus of financial regulators and surveillance and intelligence agencies and so on in that process. That's really, I think that's really important, and certainly people have argued as research that some of my colleagues and I have carried out in part of the Sprite Plus project on what we take on future payment systems and what we lose when we take away cash. We've discovered this kind of argument that people do lose the ability to do family budgeting, and they do lose the ability to share money with others in their family, or to keep track of their own purchases by virtue of keeping track of the amount of cash that they have in their physical pocket. I think that all of these things are true. However, I think that really what it comes down to, from my perspective, is something that's perhaps a bit deeper than just the privacy question, but the question of possession, right? This idea that if I have a £20 note, I have something in my possession. It's not just something that I have a legal claim on, like a bank deposit. It's actually something that I possess. And from a legal perspective, and Norton Rose Fulbright had an interesting article on this question. From a legal perspective, there's a difference between assets to which I have some kind of legal claim and assets that I actually possess. And this goes back pretty far in the history of common law. This idea of a chose in possession versus a chose in action. This idea that something that I actually possess is not something that a court can just decide is suddenly somewhere else. You can create an obligation for me to give you £20, but you can't actually physically take the £20 note for me and put it in your pocket without actually sending the police and having them rough me up a bit. That's a very different kind of question, and this is and I think that these questions about possession apply very, very clearly to this question about the future of cash, precisely because we're, by encouraging people to use the modern retail banking system, we're encouraging people to move away from transacting using things they possess and move into the world of transacting with legal claims that might be intercepted or profiled and so on, which are much weaker and really aren't and really arguably are not actually are not actually things that they actually hold in the same kind of way that they might hold cash. And just ask someone whose bank had defaulted. I mean, yes, there might be deposit insurance in much of the Western world, for example, for depositors with banks that default. But let's bear in mind that deposit insurance must exist precisely because these people don't possess that money that they put with the bank.
This is really, really interesting. So I'm just wondering as well, because maybe there's a third option, which is that, okay, so there are things you're legally entitled to, there are things that you have in your possession, but then with like a cryptocurrency, for instance, which you have in your, quote, digital wallet, I mean, it's sort of like you're technologically linked to it somehow. It's not like you're legally entitled to it per se. So maybe that's different. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I think the Norton Rose Fulbright article has an interesting perspective on this, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to opine on what this perspective ought to be, but let me say that there is this idea of fungibility that relates to this notion that I know that my money is as good as everybody else's because it's indistinguishable from everybody else's, and I know that I can transact this money without any custodian of mine blocking it because I can take this thing that's in my non-custodial wallet and I can transact it with someone else's bank instead. That's a very powerful concept, because you can imagine that the issuer of a digital currency like this could revoke the whole system, much as a central bank could decide to completely devalue the currency, but it has very strong and public incentives not to do that, first of all, and secondly, it can't, and second, it can't actually, it can't actually single me out as someone to block in this manner, the way that a financial custodian could. So I think that there is something about the custody that plays a role here. And yes, there are still questions about whether we have assets that are fundamentally intrinsically linked to a particular system versus not. Whether that system is a particular distributed ledger system or even a particular system in which banknotes are accepted. I think these are important questions to ask about the design of a currency. But let's just say that there is a fundamental difference between money that someone can freeze of mine, or money that someone can always see what I do with it, versus money that I can spend on my own terms without having to reference myself or any particular custodian. And that, I think, is an important aspect of possession.
Well, on that note, and thinking about what you mentioned there, the distributed ledger tech or the blockchain tech, what might a solution to this actually look like? And I'm thinking both in terms of, the money, the cash or the currency topic we've just been discussing, but also perhaps more broadly for other avenues of interaction that might be currently mediated by an identity card or document.
Yeah. So I think if we zoom out from beyond the money, I think that what's really interesting is if you look at the existing kinds of systems that establish truth, right? So think record systems, for example. Many times record systems reference the will of the creators of the records, and they rely upon some strong identification of the people who create records. And this idea that any disputes would be adjudicated in a court of law that becomes the unifying truth, and that's it. That's all there is to it. We identify the actors. We can drill into what the actors had intended, and we can decide what records are valid versus not. What's interesting about distributed ledger technology is that there is an absolutely different, perhaps diametrically opposed mechanism for establishing the authenticity of records, which is this idea that if we get a bunch of people at arm's length to agree on something, and we assume that they are sufficiently independent of each other, that one of them can't coerce the other into acting in a particular way, then that agreement leads to a kind of immutability of the ledger, of the record, that gives rise to this trust that we can have in that record not changing in the future. because in order to change it, you would need to convince everyone to roll back and re-sign all of the history, and convincing everyone is basically impossible. So therefore, we believe that these records are final. I think that this is a very interesting concept.
Nobody can hack Bitcoin to give themselves more money.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, right? This idea of hacking participants in the system, right? Does that undermine the immutability of the system if we actually can compromise all of the technology that these different actors use to interface with the system? I think that this is a security risk with Bitcoin, just as it is with other kinds of records, and needs to be taken as seriously. I also think that systems like Bitcoin are seldom as decentralized as we assume they are. We saw just last week with this Berlin fork in Ethereum, I think, which is part of this question. Who is really in control, and who might disagree with that control? These are really key questions, and I think that this underscores why we need institutions, why there really is no substitute for institutions. Whether it's a band of thugs or a mining pool, I don't know who's in control of Bitcoin and Ethereum, because that's the nature of permissionless ledgers. What I do know is that that someone with the resources can buy control. Now, maybe you need a lot of money to do this, or you need to arrange a big cabal, but it's certainly possible to buy control of these systems, and I think that should give us pause about whether these systems of permissionless distributed ledgers are appropriate for institutional or governmental trust.
Yeah, I guess the argument is it would be really, really hard, not just from a technological perspective, but the sheer number of people to essentially have control over the Bitcoin network. But then, there are really large entities in the world, for example, governments, authoritarian governments. You can imagine China, for instance, decides one day, okay, it's our secret policy that we're going to try and control Bitcoin. Now, maybe that would be really hard and prove impossible, but, it's not like crazy to think that that's an idea they could have,
Yeah, and let's bear in mind that China doesn't have to act alone, right? I'm sure that China has allies, as do other large governments, and they can decide, whether they want to take over the system. And it's not just governments either. I mean, there are private, non-government actors who have this kind of wealth, or who could potentially amass this kind of wealth as well.
But if your alternative is that an institution controls the ledger anyway, like how would that be better?
So I think that there's a question between control in the form of oversight and control in the form of operation. So if we have a government institution overseeing the operation of a ledger, and regulating the participants, but that the participants still make their own independent decisions, then I think that this is something that we could potentially achieve. If these institutions were to be asked to change the rules, then this could be something that would ultimately be up to the institutions to decide, right? If I'm operating the ledger as a government, or another powerful institution, like, say, Facebook or Google, for example, or a large-scale bank, then I can change the rules whenever I like, without asking anyone, without telling anyone. I can manipulate the contents of the ledger. I can re-sign things. I can mess things up. But if I have to ask other people for permission, basically, or to change the rules in a system, then that's a bit different. Because if I have to tell two different parties that they both have to download this new code and start running it, and P.S. this version is special, and I'm not going to let you audit it first, then either one of those could take that request to the public and blame the other one for leaking it. And that's a very powerful check on the ability for a central actor to coerce parties. And as networks scale larger, that power only increases. So I think that there is a difference between operating a system and overseeing it, and I think it's related to this trust question. Just because I trust a central bank with the to maintain monetary policy and oversee clearing networks, that doesn't mean that I trust a central bank with my transaction history. And that's why I would argue in favor of a decentralized system for having a check on the transaction history. Not to mention the fact that I would not want a single party to be keeping track of all of the records associated with an individual either. But it's the same reason that just because I trust a school teacher to teach a child how to read doesn't mean that I trust the school teacher to drive the school bus. I think that, and I'm not the author of that quote, by the way. But this is I think a well-known argument. We don't just because we trust someone in one context doesn't mean that we trust them in another. And we can trust someone to oversee a network without trusting them to operate it, because overseeing a network really just means this responsibility to make sure that everyone follows the rules, rather than the ability forcibly to just change the rules without telling the world. And that's, I think, a really important distinction.
Yeah, so they're almost like... I was trying to think of an analogy. I don't know if there are overseers of internet forums, perhaps, where this sort of works, where there's some level of democracy amongst the participants, but there is an overseer that moderates. I don't know if that's a good analogy or not, though.
Well, I mean, let's look at co-regulatory contexts, right? So look at best execution networks in securities trading. So in the case of MiFID in Europe, or NMS, the National Market System in the US, these are systems that basically guarantee that orders get routed to the best bid or offer in the network, and that requires everyone to publish and subscribe to a real-time feed of all of the best bids and offers that they have on their order books and every symbol that trades. And that's a collaborative effort, and that requires quite a bit of technology and quite sophisticated technology in order to be fast enough to give the different exchanges an edge. But ultimately, it did not require the governments to build or maintain that technology. It just required the government regulators to say, here's the rule, implement a system that complies with this rule, and we have these mechanisms for assuring your compliance and checking your compliance, and as long as you play by the rules, you can stay in business. And that's all that it takes. I know that that's not entirely trivial. I mean, there is quite a bit of effort in building those certification checks and fulfilling the compliance requirements. But ultimately, those systems were deployed by the private sector companies that were part of this co-regulatory organization, rather than the regulators themselves. So it's entirely possible for government to create an incentive for private sector actors to build these kinds of distributed systems and use them. This has happened before. And to be clear, I think that there are many instances of how we can use distributed ledgers to and related technologies to facilitate decentralized truth among independent actors. I think that the key to using this in a way that protects the interests of the participants in the system is making sure that we're never imposing non-consensual trust. And it's not true that just because we used a distributed ledger or a blockchain system that automatically we have consensual trust. That's not true. It depends upon how we implement the system. But by creating a mechanism for allowing us to establish truth without relying upon a central broker to adjudicate truth, I think is a powerful mechanism, a powerful tool that allows us to build systems that put the interests of the participants in mind.
Okay, well, on that note, I think I'm gonna sort of start to wrap up, but maybe I'll just end with a slightly different question than I was originally going to ask, which is you've talked a lot about like how these things could be done, but I guess the question is, will they be done? And what do the prospects look like for this kind of decentralized technology, privacy preserving technology, to be adopted by be it governments, banks, other private entities in the future? Is this something that people are really getting on board with, or is there just, do you see things are more moving in the opposite direction?
Well, I think that these kinds of technologies that will allow people to transact privately will come to pass. They will be built. The question is, who is going to build them? And when I say I'm not optimistic, I'm not. I mean, for the avoidance of doubt, I'm not saying that I'm not optimistic that these systems will be built. I am optimistic that these systems will be built. When I say I'm not optimistic, what I'm saying is I think they might be built by the wrong people. And I think that if we do not build these systems with legitimate authorities taking proactive stances to make sure that the privacy interests and control interests of individual citizens and individual persons are in mind, then people will turn to systems that are operated outside the law, perhaps by thugs or other criminal enterprises, or perhaps by foreign governments. And I think that this is a very serious concern, because it doesn't take much for a government like say China, who, for example, has already built a digital currency system, to say, we're going to build a system that provides you with verifiable privacy. And forget about the fact that we have all of these human rights abuses in our country. We're going to build a system that allows you, people in the UK, to interact with our currency privately. And won't that be really great, because you can get away from the gaze of people wanting to track your purchasing habits? I think a lot of people would take that offer. And frankly, I think that this offer is even more compelling in countries that perhaps don't have a central bank that is trusted to maintain the monetary policy at the outset. So yes, I think that these are. I think that there is a compelling argument for infrastructure that will protect people's rights. But how it's implemented is anyone's guess. I also think that people will find a way to transact privately, irrespective of what infrastructure gets used. And case in point, we know that people who are sufficiently wealthy don't need a privacy-preserving payment system in order to conduct their transactions privately. They can either have proxies do their transactions on their behalf, and certainly people with the resources will have many people who are willing to be proxies, or they can transact using mechanisms that don't involve financial payments, for example, using contracts. And I think that in these cases, we know that people with the resources will find a way to avoid surveillance. And we also know that criminals, in addition to wealthy people, but non-wealthy criminals will also find a way to transact privately using stolen credentials, or by coercing other people to conduct transactions on their behalf using force. So I think that there are many risks here. Do I believe that people will transact privately? I do believe that some people will transact privately. Do I think that we all will transact privately? Well, I think that's anyone's guess. I think it's the responsibility of governments and institutions to decide once and for all that privacy is something that is a human right, that it's an inalienable human right, and that sufficiently powerful people will get privacy no matter what we do, and that it's our task ultimately our task is to make sure that privacy is available for the most vulnerable in society. And right now, I don't think we're doing a very good job of that. We need to do much better. And every time that I go to a cafe or a restaurant here in London and have them say, "We don't take cash, sir, so your money is no good here," I wonder whether we've built a system that is designed without these people's interests in mind.
That's a really interesting point that you've made there, which is that I guess some of the counter argument to all of this would be like, oh well, what's to stop criminals being able to do? But you're saying, well, look, criminals can already do stuff. Like, it's not like they already have their ways to preserve their privacy, whether they're super rich people using proxies for offshore whatever they're doing, or whether it's drug criminals or whatever. Like, they're already doing that. They have their ways, and so put that to one side, because actually the thing that we're missing out on is the privacy for ordinary people.
Yes, that's right, and I think that that's a real problem. And to be clear, I think that we need to resolve this problem in a variety of contexts, not just the financial context, which we've spoken about a lot today, but also in the communication context. And I think that this starts with people recognizing that they have as many voices as they want. They need to stand up for having those different voices, and that they should be really wary about being forced into relationships that aren't consensual. And I think about these kinds of brokered relationships by platforms, and people being forced to accept privacy agreements in order to communicate with their friends. That's ridiculous. And we need to do something about this.
On that note, thanks very much, Geoff, for coming on the Turing podcast. It's been great speaking with you. Let me just finish by asking if people want to find out more about your work, where can they do so? And this is a question we normally ask. It sounds a little bit silly in your case, but do you have social media that people can follow?
I'm afraid not. I think the best way to get in touch with me is to send me email, or to send you email, Ed, and have that forwarded to me. I would really appreciate that. I'm really happy to talk to anyone who's interested to explore this topic further, and hopefully you can find information about my papers online using a simple search. But if you have trouble, please feel free to reach out.
Thanks very much, Geoff. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you
so much, Ed. Thank you, Rachel.
If you have an interesting topic you'd like featured on the show, a guest recommendation or a burning question, email podcast@turing.ac.uk.
The Turing podcast is hosted by Ed Cowstrew, B. Costa Gomez and Joe Dungate, and produced by Dan Whitfield for the Alan Turing Institute.
Music for the podcast was provided by Jam and Sun. You can check out his latest releases at jamandsun.bandcamp.com.